Let's talk about witches. So what exactly is a witch? Because the word witch actually comes from the Old English term Wicca or Wiki. So Wicca would be the masculine, Wiki would be the feminine. However, witch itself is a gender neutral term, and although you will find many a fictional world that sort of sets gendered definitions on words like witch, magician, wizard, warlock, the word witch does not come with a gender. However, it certainly has a gendered history if we look at something like the witch trials across Europe and North America, which, despite affecting men as well, affected women disproportionately. And I think it would be disingenuous to suggest that when various statistics give us between 75 to 85% of those tried and executed during the witch trials as being women, that there is not a gendered aspect to that. And that brings me to my next point, which is that the origins of the word witch, stemming from the Old English term Wicca, have highly negative connotations, which was a title attributed by outsiders onto others in order to other them, to associate them with black magic, the devil, and everything that wasn't Christian. The witch trials also have roots in religious discrimination on a wider scale, and there is a lot of association between witchcraft and heresy. But if we take away positive and negative connotations and consider a witch as a magical practitioner, it's actually difficult to find out what witches would have been or looked like based on the witch trials, because they weren't necessarily about those who practiced magic or healing arts. Meanwhile, there were those who practiced traditional remedies and healing arts in communities who wouldn't have been tried as witches, who were potentially considered practitioners of white magic, who might have been called cunning folk here in the UK. And in the upper echelons of European society, there were magicians and sorcerers under the employ of royalty even. And then there is a question of whether you can backdate the term witch, which is a term that derived from Old English, but there were those practicing magic, practicing traditional folk arts and crafts and remedies long before the Christianized term was coined. And there were also those individuals and gods and goddesses and heroes and heroines that were said to have conducted and practiced magic within a variety of old pagan religions. Think, for example, of Medea of Greek mythology, who predates the term witch or witchcraft, but by modern definitions could very well be described as a witch. And that is also to bring us back to the modern day, where the word witch has so many definitions. Like I mentioned before, individual fictional worlds might define witch differently, but it also exists outside of the fictional world. It has a history, which we've sort of touched on already, and it also has meaning and significance to modern practitioners of adapted pagan religions, to traditional folk arts and healing practices, like I mentioned already. And there are many today who would consider themselves witches, and in that sense you could easily say that the word witch has had a bit of a modern reclamation, in contrast with some of its more negative historical roots, whilst also recognising that magic hasn't always been seen as a negative thing across cultures and throughout times. So witch is a term with a long, varied past and present. It's almost impossible to define, yet I still plan on recommending to you here a bunch of books about witches across the genres. Although I have to say I've never read a science fiction book featuring witch, but I'm sure they're out there. So with that little bit of context, I want to recommend to you some books I love which involve witches, whether they be children's books or classics, whether they be romance or fantasy or horror or historical fiction and anything in between. I'm going to break this video down into genre sections and recommend at least 2 books in each of those sections, as well as including an array of non-fiction on the topic of historical magic and witches that you might find interesting to check out at the very end. So without further ado, let's talk about witches. So building on the introduction to this video, let's kick things off with historical fiction. I've actually recently read a few new releases that come under the category of historical witch fiction and really enjoyed them, so that was part of, I think, the inspiration behind this video, as well as some of my own recent work on witches. And one of those is The King's Witches by Kate Foster. So this is a novel with multiple perspectives, and it's predominantly about 3 women. We have Queen Anna of Denmark, Denmark who marries King James VI of Scotland at the end of the 16th century. And this is significant because King James VI of Scotland was a massive proponent of the witch trial, and it's because of his enthusiasm for these horrific trials that so many women in Scotland in particular were murdered. And it's a very dark period in Scottish history in particular because there was such a high proportion of witch trials and executions. And this book looks at a pivotal moment in that, one of the earliest witch trials under James specifically, which were the trials that begun in North Berwick and were inspired by the witch trials in Denmark that he learnt about through his marriage to Anna. Anna herself in this novel is a young woman basically figuring out what it means to be a queen who has been thrown into this marriage and is trying to kind of manage the best she can in the situation she's in, whilst also hearing all of this paranoia about witches going on around her. And then we have a young woman in North Berwick who's accused of witchcraft, and Anna's maidservant, an older woman from Denmark but who has also spent time in Scotland, and I don't want to say much more about her because there's a lot to learn about her past and her story throughout this book. And not only is this a novel that very much situates itself in the history, like it's very rooted in history and it feels like you're travelling back in time. It's a novel which very sensitively examines the lives and experiences of three women, how they intersect, how their backgrounds affect the projections of their lives, and how they may be connected to one another. And in that sense it's quite empowering, if about a very tumultuous and difficult period in history, and I thought it was very well done. We then have a novel which is both historical and contemporary, but I felt it best fit into this category because it's a dual timeline novel by C.J. Cooke. And in one timeline we follow Alison, who is based on a real figure in Scottish history and the first woman to have been executed for witchcraft in the Orkney Islands. And we follow the accusations that she faces and her subsequent trial in the past, whilst also following the story of a mother in the present day in Glasgow whose daughter has returned from Orkney under incredibly difficult circumstances. She went there on holiday with her boyfriend and a friend, only for her boyfriend to die and for her to suffer serious burns in a fire that nobody can explain. And there's obviously a link between these two stories. You're almost simultaneously reading a modern day mystery and a historical fiction, but they blend together perfectly. I think the novel, whilst being both fascinating in both timelines, benefits from the coexistence of those timelines because it kind of demonstrates to us the timelessness of certain themes. It shows the relevancy of the past to the present, and also just from a reading perspective it really keeps you turning those pages, shall we say. I really enjoy novels in general that do multiple timelines, so this was really well done. Then we have a novel set a few decades later but still very much in the midst of the witchcraft panic during the 1620s in Lancashire, England, which is Cunning Women by Elizabeth Lee. And this is one of those novels again that plays on that idea of cunning folk versus witches. When does somebody become a witch historically in the eyes of the church, in the eyes of the government, in the eyes of the crown, and when do they become prosecuted for that? And it's about distrust in communities, it's about judgment, it's about othering and outsiders, and it's also about forbidden love. And it's a very intense novel in which you become very invested in the protagonist Sarah's life, and you just want things to be okay, but you're never sure if they're going to be, and you can see this insidious rise of distrust growing in her community, and it's quite frightening to read. Then lastly, for historical fiction, is a book which is actually half non-fiction and half historical fiction, but again I felt like it best fit in this category, and that is We Are All Witches by Mary Kidd. So this book is specifically about the Scottish witch trials, and each chapter is about a different person who was tried and executed during the witch trials, whose name we have recorded in the historical records for this period, and who we know varying amounts about. We might know very, very little about them, more than a name and where they were from, or we might have quite a few details. We might even have their recorded confession, of course these confessions being taken under massive duress and torture and not necessarily to be trusted. And Mary Kidd presents both the historical information in this book in a very accessible accessible way, so you can learn a little bit about that history, whilst also writing short stories for every person in this book, for every name that she takes, and bringing their experiences to life. So she writes a story from their perspective, elaborating on the historical detail we do have, and imagining how they might have felt, what their lives might have been like, why they might have ended up in the position they ended up in, and what they might have felt and thought and said in their final days. So in that sense, they are very much short stories, which are Mary Kidd's imaginings. So yeah, non-fiction meets fiction. But given how dark and often depressing the historical fiction dealing with witches can often be, let's move on next to romance, because that has a little bit more cheer and a little bit more of a guaranteed happy ending. So first up, we have a contemporary romance mystery novel, paranormal romance mystery called Black Witch Magic. So this is a dual perspective romance novel where we have a witch in a small town in America who has, or is victim to, a family curse, which means that she cannot leave this town. As much as she'd like to go adventure around the world and discover what's out there and see and do different things, she literally cannot cross the town's borders. But her life does change and the outside world comes into her world when our second protagonist comes into town, who is the host of a paranormal TV show. So he's basically the host of a ghost hunting TV show, but he's the skeptic. Like, he doesn't really believe in ghosts. He's the skeptic to his co-host's like true believer. And he ends up meeting our protagonist and they develop romantic feelings for each other, but it's her house that he's supposed to be here to be investigating, and it's whether their two worlds can mesh while also figuring out if there is something a little bit more sinister going on in this town. And I also have to say that I really appreciated, in the first instance of our couple coming together and having sex, it is actually awkward and it's not necessarily the greatest thing either of them have ever experienced, which I think is really honest and nice to see depicted in a romance book, because you don't often get that. Sticking with contemporary paranormal romances, we then just more generally have the Bathhouse series by Lillian Lark. This is a series of paranormal romances which are very heavy on the smut, so bear that in mind if that's not your thing, but which have witchcraft and witches woven throughout. So there's not always a witch as a main character, but there quite often is, and there definitely is in the first book. So Stalked by the Kraken is another dual perspective romance where we follow Rose, a matchmaker and witch, who helps run her family's bathhouse. Now this is a very specific kind of bathhouse where basically monsters go to have a good time, and they are able to sort of siphon off the magic from those amorous encounters, and she is also involved in matchmaking, so in a much more formal way for people looking for mates, lifelong partners, etc. However, her own love life isn't going as great until she is approached by her other perspective, Gideon, an ancient kraken who has taken a liking to her. Either you want to read monster romances or you don't, that's all I can really say on that, but if you want one featuring witches, this one does. And then in book 2 we also follow a witch who is matchmade by Rose with a gargoyle, so there you go. Then we have Phoenix Unbound by Grace Draven, which is both fantasy and romance, so I wasn't quite sure whether to put this into romance or fantasy, but it feels primarily like a romantasy, which I think then falls into romance as a subgenre, but hey ho. This Grace Draven in general is one of, if not my favourite romantasy writer. I love her romantasy storylines, and this is one which is set in a high fantasy world where we follow an escaped gladiator who had been enslaved, and he escapes with the help of a fire witch who has been executed, or has like been put up to be executed, but has also managed to escape. So they're both basically fleeing from a kingdom or government that wants them dead, that absolutely hates them, they're outcasts, and they're trying to make it back to the gladiator's home where he's actually quite an important figure, and along the way they fall in love. But as well as being a romance between those two, it's also about following the building political uprising, which then feeds into the sequel and another romantic coupling between two new characters. So it's got those high stakes, it's got that high fantasy element, and it's also got a romance. It's got a bit of all of it. And then lastly we have Written, which is the first in the Librarian's Coven series, I think it's called, by Catherine Moon, which is a series following the same set of characters throughout each novel, so it's not like a new couple in each book, but it's about a librarian at this magical university who, you know, loves her books, really into being a librarian, but never thought of herself as a witch or a magician like the professors and students at this university, until it turns out that maybe she does have magical powers. Maybe she is actually an incredibly powerful witch. Her witchcraft is just tied to literature and writing and books, which I know is something a lot of us will love thematically. And throughout the books she's basically learning to wield that power while also falling in love with her coven of 3 male witches. So we've got a polyamorous group romance, we've got a magical university, and we've got characters learning to wield magic just in time to fight evil. Again, a little bit of everything. On that note, I should probably just move directly into fantasy, right? Because there's so much overlap here between fantasy and witchy romances. In terms of fantasy, my first book recommendation is actually more about a wise woman, a healer, who doesn't necessarily call herself a witch, but could be categorised as such. And that is Dreamer's Pool, which is the first in a trilogy called the Blackthorn and Grimm trilogy. And this book series is by one of my favourite fantasy authors of all time, who writes historical fantasy, predominantly set in medieval Ireland, including this series, that is Juliet Marillier. And in this book we follow Blackthorn and Grimm, who have both escaped prison together, and they're basically setting off to start a new life. They didn't know each other before being in prison, so they're kind of reluctant companions, particularly on Blackthorn's side. She is a grumpy wise woman. It's basically a Grumpy Sunshine story, but he's the sunshine and she's the grumpy. And they find themselves a small rundown cottage where Blackthorn can practice her craft, whilst Grimm tags along and rebuilds this home. But naturally life isn't about to go smoothly for them, and they end up having to assist the local prince whose fiance has turned up. It's acting very oddly, and it's so... And this is one of my favourite books of all time. I love Juliet Marillier's writing, and in particular this and the first book in the Seven Wars series, Daughter of the Forest, are 2 of the most wonderfully written fantasy novels, 2 of the most wonderfully written historical fantasy novels I've ever read. I think they're incredible. I love her writing. It really creates such a vivid picture of this fantastical version of medieval Ireland, and the characters are always so complex, so layered, so rich, and I love following along on their journeys. There's a very, very slow burn romance in this series, but like very slow burn, so it's not necessarily about the romance by any stretch of the imagination. We then have Weird Sisters by Terry Pratchett, which is one of many witchy books by Terry Pratchett set in his Discworld. So Weird Sisters is about a bunch of weird sisters. No, it's about 3 witches who are part of a coven in the world of the Discworld that Terry Pratchett's created. Again, you can very much like start here with the Discworld. This is a great jumping in point. And in this story we're getting to know these 3 witches, Magret, Granny Weatherwax, Nanny Og, 3 characters who will come up in future books, particularly like Granny Weatherwax. She's iconic. She's also in the Wee Free Men books, and you're getting to know them and their dynamic. They represent different tropes of witchcraft in sort of traditional storytelling. That's something that Terry Pratchett plays around with a lot in his books, tropes and stereotypes, and from that comes up with these incredibly witty, incredibly clever and imaginative comedic fantasy novels. And if you want to laugh out loud, like if you want belly laughs, then read Terry Pratchett's Discworld, read The Weird Sisters, and if you also like Shakespeare references, there's a lot of fun ones in this. Then lastly, for specifically fantasy, because let's be honest, some of the horror recommendations probably fall under fantasy too as a subgenre, we actually have a short story collection, and that is Kissing the Witch by Emma Donoghue. So this is one of my favourite short story collections of all time, and it's a collection of fairy tale retellings which obviously play with the idea of the evil witch. I think like the title gives that away, and what these short stories do is sort of question the role and position and relationship between women in traditional fairy tales, which can often be quite toxic, which can often set women against one another, which can often play women as stereotypes, like the evil stepmother and the evil witch. And throughout these stories, each woman sort of reclaims her narrative and quite often ends up kissing the witch. So the princess, instead of falling in love with the prince, might fall in love with the evil stepmother or the evil witch. So in that sense, there's a fantastic sapphic thread throughout each story, and I just think this is such a clever play on a lot of popular, well-known fairy tales that is very empowering, very sort of emotional and beautiful and relatable, and I really, really love each one. On the topic of traditional folk and fairy tales, actually, let's move on to classics next. And the first book I want to recommend in this section is one I edited, I hope you don't mind, but this just came out and it's very much been on my mind because it is about witches, and we're sort of in the witching season where more people are talking about witches and the history of witchcraft. So it's very present in my mind, but I didn't write the stories in this collection. It is a edited anthology of classics stories from folklore and mythology around the world called Witches, Wizards and Sorcerers, Myths and Legends, published by Macmillan's Collectors Library. Like I said, I was the editor of this book, so I compiled and chose each of the stories that got included. So I did a lot of reading, a lot of research, and found a selection of 19 stories to be specific, which I felt covered quite a nice breadth of magical practitioners throughout traditional folk lore and mythology, some of which you may be familiar with, some of which you may not. So for example, some of these stories I've included in here are more popular, well-known fairy tales like Hansel and Gretel, as well as what I would consider lesser known stories like The Witch of Fife, which is a traditional Scottish folk tale, the stories of three magicians who lived under the ancient empire, which is a story from ancient Egypt, Carried Away by the Wind, which is one of my favourite Polish folk tales, and more stories including those from Polynesia and France and Korea and Ireland and many more. Like I said, there's 19 stories in here. And my intentions with this collection were to, first and foremost, of course, create an entertaining collection that you'll just enjoy reading, to show the kind of diversity of magical practitioners across the world and across time, and to demonstrate that some of the tropes or stereotypes we have about witches in mythology and folklore can often be just as easily undermined. For every evil witch, there's a good witch. For every good wizard, there's an evil wizard. And I enjoy observing both the contrast and overlap in different stories. So I compiled, like I said, 19 for this collection, as well as writing up a little introduction which includes a little history of witchcraft, the term witch, and what that means, as well as short introductions to each story, providing a little bit of context and background to each one. So if that's something you're interested in, if you'd like to read a collection of classic tales which I have chosen, then you can check this little book out. But I do have another classic I really want to talk about, which is actually a novel, and I've talked about this book a lot recently. I think I've managed to squeeze it into a few videos, but I'm going to squeeze it into this one too because I love it, and that is Lolly Willows by Sylvia Townsend Warner. So this book is, unsurprisingly, about Lolly Willows. It originally came out in the 1920s, and it follows Lolly Willows in her early years as a child, teenager, taking care of her father, as she's the only one that's still at home after her mother dies and her brothers have gone off and got married, through her early adulthood and into sort of her 40s and 50s. So in that sense, it takes place from the late 1800s into the early 1900s, but with a particular focus of Lolly Willows in her sort of 40s, when she's sort of reached an age where she's very much considered a spinster, and she has had opportunities to marry, but she has actively chosen to sort of undermine those. She's never had any desire to marry anybody. She never really wanted to leave the house that she lived in with her father, but after he died, it was left to another one of her brothers, and she then had to go live with her other brother and her sister-in-law in London and take care of their kids, and she's just sort of passed around as this spinster aunt who can help raise kids and be handy around the house. And because she's chosen not to get married, she's not really seen as having an existence outside of how she's useful to this family unit until she reaches this age. And she goes to her family and she says, look, I'm moving to the countryside. I'm going to live by myself. I'm going to live an independent life. I'm going to wander around the forests and learn about the local community, and I'm done with this city life and I'm kind of done with helping you all. And she sets off. She does have some income because she's from an upper class family, and she's able to get some lodgings and again start this sort of independent phase of her life. which in large part involves her taking up witchcraft. She strikes a deal with the devil and takes up witchcraft, and this book is very much playing, firstly, on those negative connotations of witchcraft that are associated with things like the witch trial, where witches are seen as sort of lovers of the devil who do terrible things in the night, and etc, etc, but instead approaches it with a lens of female empowerment and female liberation on a sort of independent solo level. It's not a book about revolution, but it's a book about how one woman finds liberation and independence through witchcraft, and I think it's such a phenomenal concept. Like, it's not the book that you expect when I tell you it's from the 1920s, because in some ways that feels like such a modern concept, and it'd be so interesting to be there in the time it came out and to sort of see its reception firsthand, because I'm sure it ruffled a few feathers, but I think it's really well done. It's a very like slow-paced, quiet, kind of cozy novel, to be honest, and I absolutely adore it. Next up, let's talk about two horror novels. So the first one I want to talk about is The Hacienda by Isabel Canas, which is a historical gothic horror with a undercurrent of romance, although that's quite a common feature of gothic, so it's probably no surprise. And it's about a young woman named Beatrice in the aftermath of the Mexican War of Independence, which her father actually was executed during, and her station has sort of fallen in life. Her and her mother have gone to live with an aunt, and it's not necessarily a very glamorous or happy life. So she chooses to marry a man she doesn't necessarily love, an older man who will give her a home and allow her to be the mistress of her own home, in which she hopes she can bring her mother into and sort of like create her own sense of safety, really, to create this like safe space in this place where she can have a family. But when she gets to this hacienda and meets her sister-in-law and gets to know the house a little bit, she realizes that this maybe isn't going to be the happy place that she thought it was going to be. It's not going to be the safe place she thought it was going to be. There are creepy visions and creepy sounds, and she ends up having to request the assistance of the local priest, who's also a witch. So he has two very conflicting sides to his identity, and it's actually multiple perspective between both of these characters who find themselves drawn to one another, and it's very beautiful and atmospheric, very like creepy and sinister, but also kind of romantic in a sort of like traditional sort of romantic literature sense, rather than necessarily being a romance novel. Like, it just has that kind of sweeping, dark, romantic vibe, if that makes sense, that you might expect from a gothic. And it also has a real sense of time and place. Like, I really felt like I was transported back in time. I sort of had my eyes open to a little bit of history that I didn't know about, and then became more curious about, and it felt very rich and very well researched. A contemporary horror novel I have to recommend, though, is White is for Witching by Helen Oyemi, and I've been talking about this book for almost 10 years. I read this book, I think, in 2016. It was one of the first books I believe I read when I started working at Pan Macmillan, because it was a Pan Macmillan publication, and I fell in love with it immediately and have been recommending it ever since. So I'm just going to recommend it again, really. It's a sinister haunted house novel about a young woman who's the newest generation of women in her family, and through her mother's side of the family there is this strand of witchcraft in that they are believed and said to be witches. But this identification with witchcraft and all of the sort of historical and contemporary ideas that comes with is very much tied in to their family home, and when her mother passes away, she and her father and her brother all go to live in this ancestral family home, which then takes a possessive liking to her. This house does not want to let go of this young woman, and you hear parts of the book itself are narrated by the house. There's also a sapphic subplot to this novel. It's very, like I said, eerie, sinister, but beautifully, beautifully written. Now, my next category is not really a genre. It's probably a subcategory of the fantasy section of this video, so I probably should have included it there, but it is children and young adult novels. So these are books aimed at slightly younger readers, whether it be the sort of middle grade range or teenagers, but they can of course be read and enjoyed by adults, and I've read them all as an adult and really enjoyed them as well. So let's talk about those next. The first one is Hedge Witch by Skye McKenna. This is the first in a middle grade series, so traditionally that's sort of a 9 to 12-year-old age range, but that's so prescriptive. This is such a wonderful, charming, cozy, adventurous series that I don't care what age you are, if you are capable of reading this book, just read it. Like whether you're 7 or 70 or somewhere in between or beyond, then this is such a lovely series. It's about a young girl who has lived the past few years of her life at a boarding school where her mother left her, and she's basically been waiting for her mother to come back for her all these years later, but to no avail. And instead of her mother coming to get her, it's a magical talking cat, because it's a children's book, and magical talking cats are such a phenomenal feature of children's literature. More adult books should have magical talking cats, as far as I'm concerned. So this magical talking cat comes and gets her and whisks her away to her aunt's house, her mother's sister, because they hadn't known that she existed up until now. And her aunt actually leads or teaches the local witchcraft school. So she's like the sort of head witch of their local village, and she then and our protagonist ends up attending this witchcraft school and learning to be a witch alongside her fellow pupils. But she never forgets about her mother, and she's really curious about what happened to her mother. Nobody seems to know, so she's also investigating that part of the storyline as well, which maybe takes her down some slightly more dangerous paths. For young adult novels, we first of all have A Cat-a-Witch by Nnedi Okorafor, which follows our protagonist Sunny, who's at that point in her life where she's just becoming a teenager. She's sort of like a preteen going into her teenage years. She's on the this is on the younger side of young adult literature, and she originally grew up in America, but her family have moved back to Nigeria, where they're originally from. So she is making new friends, she's getting to know new people, and she's also discovering that she might be a witch, because this is a video about witch books. So along with all the ordinary stuff that you have to do, so along with all the ordinary aspects of life at that age, she ends up attending this extracurricular sort of local witchcraft school with her fellow pupils, and they end up investigating a sort of serial murderer, series of murders that are going on, and discovering that there might be a magical element to them. Then towards the slightly older side of YA, we have This Poison Heart by Kaylin Bayron. This is a book that I'm not sure necessarily uses the word witch, but as I very much harked on about at the beginning of this video, witch is a very sort of elusive term anyway, but it is very much about magic and about something that's many, I think, would term witchcraft. Our teenage protagonist in this novel has a magical affinity with plants. So plants respond to her. If she's sad, plants will. If she's happy, plants grow. She can sometimes control it, sometimes can't, so it can go a little bit awry. And she's been just living an ordinary life in New York with her two mums in their flower shop, trying to sort of, you know, exist with this weird power that she has. She was, however, adopted, and at the beginning of this novel she learns that her biological aunt has left her family home in her will, and she's been missing for so long that her will's been enacted. So she and her two mums move into this big house in sort of more rural upstate New York, and that's where she learns that maybe this magic that is inherent to her is something she inherited from her family, and it ties into Greek mythology with figures like Medea and Circe. Our character is called Briseis, but she's not the Briseis of mythology, but there are references to the Medea and the Circe of Greek mythology. So it's a book that very much ties in the ancient to the contemporary and looks at the sort of passing on of this magic and mythology to the sort of present day. Alright, carrying on with genres that aren't really genres, we now have some graphic novels slash comic books I want to recommend to you. The first one is Black Magic. This is quite a dark, gritty comic book series which follows a New York City police detective who is also a witch. She is a very powerful witch from a very powerful coven who have been around for a very long time, and some people might be a little bit older than they look in this series. It is really interesting because it's both sort of like gritty procedural with a sort of noir vibe and a very limited colour palette to go alongside that in the artwork, but also this like magical, almost supernatural storyline. So it's like police procedural meets Supernatural, a TV show, but the main character is a witch. That's like what I feel this storyline is, and I really like that dark gritty side to it. I really like how the art really embodies the storyline, and all in all I think it's just been executed really well. Slightly less dark, although there are like intense moments, but somewhat more like upbeat generally, is Spells on Wheels. This is the story of three friends who make up a coven together, but their house is broken into and a lot of their magical artifacts are stolen. So they need to figure out where these things have gone, because some of them in particular are very important and should not get into the hands of regular mortals, only to discover they're being sold on like a magical version of eBay. So they end up on a road trip to retrieve all these items, hoping that they will solve the mystery of who stole them through finding them. And it's fun, fast-paced, full of found family and mystery, and just, you know, absolutely perfect. Another one where the artwork perfectly matches the tone, but I think that probably goes without saying, because when you're reading something in graphic format, the art is as important, if not more important, than the words, let's be honest, right? Like they are they're a team. So for the final piece to be good, I think the team needs to work together. We then have a standalone graphic novel, which is Mooncakes, and this is the story of a wolf and a werewolf. And this is the story of a witch and a werewolf. So they were childhood friends, but they haven't seen each other in years, and our werewolf character comes back to town, which is a sort of fantastical version of modern day rural America. And on a personal level, they're figuring out themselves and what they mean to each other now, as they are as adults, but also the fact that there is something nefarious going on in their town. Then we have Witch Hat Atelier, which is a manga series about a little girl named Coco who would love to be a witch. But in this world, witchcraft is for those who are born with magic. It's a very hierarchical system. You can't just learn to be a witch. Basically, like the fancy people are witches and the rest of them are not. Except her life might take her closer to the magical world than she expected when, at the beginning of the series, she ends up with the position of assistant to the Witch Hat Atelier. This is another sort of all ages series, which is very charming and rich in world building with beautiful art. And with that, we have reached my final category, which is non-fiction. So I've actually grabbed the physical copies of a lot of the books I want to show you in this section, because so many of them involve sort of interesting design elements and illustrations and accompanying pictures that I thought it would just be nice to look at them in their all. And first of all, I actually want to talk about two books. So this is part of a series. It's actually part of a 3-book series, which I guess actually the third one we can talk about too. So the third book doesn't actually have the word witch in the title, which was why I didn't initially pick it up, but you know, they all go together and they all do a similar thing, and that is Magic of Mushrooms, Witch's Garden and Witch's Forest, which you can see here, all published by Kew Botanical Gardens. And these books are obviously all about plant life, specifically the sort of traditional uses and beliefs around those plants. So for example, in Witch's Garden, which is this one here, the book is broken up into a number of sections, from plants of the ancient world, great minds, from superstition to science and back, the seasons, stations of life, and many, many more. And then within those sections you will find a plant like the blackberry, as sort of illustrated here. I love these old school sort of flora and fauna illustrations, and it will tell you a little bit about the sort of magical history of that plant. Each chapter also has an introduction on the sort of theme of said chapter. So this chapter here is Superstition to Science and Back, and it sort of explores what that means in terms of plants, and there's so much in here. Like, there's so much to read. It's a book you can flick through and look at individual plants, or you can read from cover to cover, because there is so much narrative in there as well in terms of the non-fiction with each chapter section, and it teaches you about how, and it tells you about where these plants have appeared in folklore. It teaches you about how they were used traditionally, if they were associated with magic or not. Do they have medicinal properties? Do they not have medicinal properties? Are they associated with good luck or bad luck or other aspects of life? And they are so fascinating. Like, I love this series. I think it's really accessible to people who aren't necessarily very knowledgeable about plants like me. They're a great place to jump in if you like a sort of historical approach to things and are just more curious about the history of plant lore. For those who would like to read a little bit of a more in-depth account of the witch trials, or one sort of specific instance of the witch trials phenomenon across Europe and North America, other than We Are All Witches, which I mentioned in in my historical fiction section as being both non-fiction and fiction. This is The Ruin of Witches by Malcolm Gaskill, Life and Death in the New World. So Malcolm Gaskill is a scholar of witchcraft and particularly the witch trials, and this book is specifically about the witch trials in North America. So if you read The Crucible in school, like I did, it's the backdrop to what happened in that very, very famous story and the real history behind it and what was going on with the witch panic, how that was handled largely specifically in New England. And it's obviously a very, again, difficult period of history where a lot of people were victimised and wrongly executed, and Malcolm Gaskill provides a deep dive into that in this book. If you really want to start at the beginning, if you want an overview of witches in history, folklore and pop culture, then why not check out a children's book? This is often one piece of advice I have when talking about different non-fiction subjects, and I use it myself, which is that if you don't know much about a topic, read a children's book about it, because they are incredibly accessible, usually incredibly engaging, and often have phenomenal pictures. So this is Secrets of the Witch, an initiation into our history and our wisdom. Again, beautiful book. It even has like a little ribbon tie. What a detail. It's published by Wide-Eyed Books, and this is what it looks like inside. There are so many gorgeous illustrations, some of which are quite gruesome, to be honest, but like really captivating, and like I honestly want some of them printed off and hung on my wall. I really, really love them. But not only is it beautifully laid out, it covers a really wide breadth of witch history and witch lore. So for example, from the context page, I can tell you that the first section is on nature as a magical force, and it looks at that throughout lore. So we've got like ancient Greek lore in here, we've got ancient Egyptian mythology. It then leads us into the Middle Ages and the distrust of magic, the Renaissance witch hunts, the triumph of reason, romanticism and reenactment, the witch's return, magic symbols and practical magic. So it really looks at witches on a lot of different levels, from history to mythology to pop culture to modern beliefs and practices, and I think that's really, really nice, and it makes a really nice starting place as well as just a beautiful book on your shelf. But when I'm talking about beautiful books on witches, I can't not talk about this book, which you often see behind me in my videos because I have it facing outwards. It's so beautiful. Like, I need this on display constantly in my office, and that is the Taschen book on witchcraft. So Taschen are a publisher whose speciality is art books. They focus on books with a lot of illustrations, a lot of pictures, a lot of artwork included, and this is part of a series called the Library of Esoterica. There's one on plants, there's one on tarot, there might be more, and I'd love to check those out eventually, but for now I've got my witchcraft one and I'm very, very happy with it because it's not only stunning but it's also fascinating. So it's primarily looking at witchcraft through visual culture, but that is something that extends so far back in history that it manages to cover a lot and talk about a lot. So jumping off artworks from throughout history, it's able to explore the history of witchcraft in a very broad sense and do deep dives on lots of different topics. As you can see, this is like a massive book and it's not just all pictures, there's so much text in here. So the contents includes everything from a brief history of witchcraft in the Western world, persecution and empowerment, reconciling witchcraft and global folk traditions, cycles of ritual and renewal, the magic circle in witchcraft, the witch and the moon, types of magic, art as a spell, the witch in pop culture, the many faces of witches. Like, if you want a book that's going to cover a little bit of everything and do it in an incredibly detailed and visual way, this is the book. This is one of the most beautiful books on my bookshelf, and it's one that I love just flipping through. Like, I find it quite inspiring if you like to write fantasy, to be honest. These are the kind of books I would recommend buying. Like, buy yourself some art books which feature sort of fantastical artwork of mythology and magic, because flicking through this kind of thing is what inspires me so often. I mean, I very much had in mind a lot of the pre-Raphaelite artwork when I was writing my Arthurian retelling, which is out next year. But last but not least, we have the Oxford Illustrated History of Witchcraft and Magic, acknowledging here that magic goes beyond witchcraft, but that witchcraft can also be quite an all-inclusive term. And this is by Owen Davies, another scholar who I have a few books by and writes a lot on the history of magic. So this is another one which naturally has a lot of pictures. It's the Oxford Illustrated History, although it's like a little bit less intense than Taschen. It's definitely also a little bit more affordable, but it does help. Like, I like the inclusion of pictures. I like a picture, what am I going to say? But I find it really interesting interesting. So, you know, we've got like artwork here from the 1700s, and then we've got films from the 20th century. It's showing how witchcraft and magic have been a part of both our visual culture and our history and just art in general for centuries and millennia. But if you have not come away from this video with at least one new book to check out, one recommendation that appeals to you, one book on witches that you haven't already read, then I have to concede to you as the master of witchcraft literature. I am defeated, and that is absolutely okay. In fact, if you have any recommendations for novels, graphic novels, non-fiction books, even films and television that focus on and centre around witches and witchcraft, I'd love to hear about them. I'd love to read them, I'd love to watch them. I'm always looking for new recommendations. But I hope you did find something in this video. Let me know if you plan on checking any of them out. I'll always love to know if I've managed to successfully recommend something. And until next time, happy witching!